All right, we're back. We are COMP253. That's Assets for Game Developers. And it's week 9, part 1 of our broadcast. We're talking about hard surface modeling in Blender. So a little bit of a recap. Last week, we started with Blender. We also did a little bit of sound as well. We're going to hit that sound stuff again at some point. But right now, what I want to talk about is how to do stuff with Blender. All right, so review. If I want to delete a shape in Blender in object mode, how do I do it? What's the shortcut key for deleting a shape? Anyone remember? X. Thank you very much. So if I want to delete my shape here, you notice I can just click X and delete. One thing I need to do because I'm broadcasting is I need to change my display settings. I'm going to do that so you guys can see a little bit better. I'm going to go to 125%. Typically, that's pretty good for you guys. All right, here we go. So this is you should be able to see this stuff a little bit better, which is what I wanted. All right, so I deleted my shape. If I want to get it back, Control-Z puts it back. I was able to fix my problem. Click Control-Z. I had a problem with Blender I had to reinstall, so I got it back. So again, if I press X, that's the shortcut key. Notice if you press delete, also the delete key also works, and you see the shortcut key right here, okay? One thing to note is if you want to delete something, Blender, like I talked about last week, has a search function. Do you remember how to do the search in Blender? Spacebar. Spacebar picks up anything you want. So if you want to delete something, if I type in delete, as an example, you can see that if I want to do an object delete, it tells you the shortcut key there. That's one of the best ways to learn the shortcut keys in Blender. Just do the search, and it'll come up. Okay. We have 3 objects in the original scene. If I press Control-N to start up a new default scene, on the left we have the toolbar. There's a toolbar in object mode. Right now we're in object mode. So far we've talked about 2 modes: object mode and edit mode, right? And object mode just moves objects around. All right, that's what it does. You can also do some other deformations. You can stretch and squash objects. You can do a bunch of different things. Okay, how do I rotate an object? What's the key to rotate? R. It's very simple. If I want to rotate, notice it's free rotation this way, and I have this little gizmo here. It's like a little wire. I don't know if you're sure if you can see it. But the little wire basically allows me to rotate faster or slower in Blender. If I'm closer up, it's fast. If I'm farther away, it's slower. And if I press the Shift key, right, as an example, I rotate much slower. Take a look at the rotation number on the bottom left-hand corner of my screen. Bottom left-hand corner of your screen, when you rotate, it shows you the rotation amount. Like notice, like I can keep going around like this and keep going around until I get the rotation I want. By pressing the Shift key, I can rotate it much slower around if I just keep doing this, okay? Almost like I'm turning a crank, right? I'm turning something. If I press the normal thing, I can see that my rotation flies around way faster. If I press, if I'm pressing Control, it's actually every 5 degrees. Notice how it's doing now. I can go 5 degrees by rotating it. This is really cool for Control. Yes. Yes. Yep.
You only rotate on the X.
Right. Excellent. So you remember that. So yeah. So right now I'm rotating free. If I press X now, even when I'm not stopping my rotation, if I press X, now I'm only rotating on the X-axis. But if I press Control now, while I'm in there, you can see it's 5 degrees on the X-axis. So if you want to be very specific, you can do that. Okay. If I press Escape, when I press Escape, when I do a translation like this, some kind of transformation, okay, it cancels out what I was doing if I press Escape. So if I'm not happy with what I'm doing, I can press Escape and get out of there. All right. So a little bit more control. I'm going to go zoom in here. I zoom in and out with my middle mouse wheel. Okay, that's where I can do that. If I press the middle mouse wheel and move around, again, I orbit or around the scene, right? If I press the middle mouse wheel and hit Shift, I pan around. I can actually pull the scene around like this. This is very important for us to do that. Okay, the other thing you want to do is if some shortcut keys on the numeric keypad. Numeric keypad in Blender is really important. Shortcut keys. If I press the dot on the numeric keypad, it zooms me right into the object that I'm looking at, right? or the vertice or the face or whatever I'm looking at. So the dot, the actual decimal point on the numeric keypad, right? If I press the 5 key on the numeric keypad, it puts me into orthographic mode. So this is orthographic, this is perspective. Orthographic, perspective, right? Orthographic mode is when everything appears to be the same size, no matter how far away it is, right? Perspective, the objects that are closer to you appear to be bigger. The objects that are farther away appear to be smaller, but actually it's the same size, right? So that's one thing you can do. If I press the 1 key on your numeric keypad, right, it rotates it to the front. And this sometimes it's easier for us to model when we have only one side. We're looking at it from one side of the three-dimensional object. Okay, so here we can see that we're in a front view, right? But we're in front perspective. On the top left corner, it tells you what perspective we're in. Front perspective. To be absolutely more accurate, front orthographic is easier. So if I press the 5 key now, I'm in front ortho view, and it looks perfectly flat, almost like a 2D object. Hint, this is interesting. You can do all your 2D work in Blender by going into this mode. If I want to make a 2D scene or something that looks 2D, I want to do some 2D animation, we're going to get there later, I can use Blender for this. I can actually go in here and use this, make a scene in 2D, and then, like, for example, if I'm sketching something out for your GDD, I can do a sketch in Blender in 2D by going into this orthographic mode, putting in my shapes that I want, taking a snapshot, and good to go, right? Like, there's lots of stuff you guys can do here to be creative, right? Typically, we don't do that, but you could. All right, if I go back into perspective mode for a second, and if I want to get out of here, I can press the middle mouse wheel again, and I can rotate back out, right? Middle mouse wheel will just take me back out into my user perspective. Notice when I go out of there, from front, it says user perspective. User perspective means I'm in my own custom perspective, whatever that is, okay? If I press the 1 key again, bam, I'm into front. 3 key on the numeric keypad goes to the right, okay? So it rotates to the right. The 7 key is from the top, okay? 7 key is top perspective. If you want to do the bottom, you can press Control and 7 key, and that'll do the bottom of the object. If I want to do the back, I can press Control in the 1 key, and that'll do the back perspective. If I want to do the left, I can press Control and the 3 key, and it'll take me to the left perspective. All right, so that's how you do it when it comes to perspective. So if I want to move things around, so it's really kind of cool in terms of this. Okay, cool. Other things. What are these arrows called in Blender? What are they? What is this thing? There's 2 names for it typically in different programs. What do you think it's called? There's actually a name for it. The gizmo, that's what Unity calls it, and Maya calls it, and all those kind of things. In Blender, it's called a manipulator, right? Object manipulator or manipulator arms, however you want to call it, right? The gizmo or the manipulator can be hidden. All right, so on the bottom left, on the bottom of Blender here, this bottom row, you can actually bring it up so you can see it. So if I want to bring this whole thing up, I can just drag it up so you can see this part. So these buttons here, there's some buttons that are in Blender, and you can see them. If I click this little button right here that looks like the manipulator, it goes away. All right, so you just can't see it. It just hides it. Okay, if I put it back, oops, I put it back, it comes back. Notice that the manipulator looks like this, but if I press this arc, it looks like this. The arc allows me to rotate across one axis with more accuracy. So I can kind of do one of these, right? So instead of pressing the keyboard commands, I can use the buttons. Is that cold? If I press this one with the little arm and a little square on it, like I talked about last week, it actually allows you to stretch an object, right? Or resize, or scale. That's the right way to do it. And the shortcut keys for these are, what's the shortcut key for scaling? Do you remember? S. S for scale. If I just press S, it scales uniformly across all axes. If I press S and then the axis, for example, the y-axis, I can scale only across the y-axis, right? Again, I can use this little thing, this little, looks like a little rope, if you will, that connects to my these arrows. And if I press the Control key again, I get every 5 units, 0.5 units, right? If I press the Shift key, I get a very small scale, very, very small. So I want to be more accurate. Press Control and Shift. You get very accurate and very small. Okay. Also notice on the left, look over here on the left, I see that the constraints, I can't do it, but on the left-hand side here where my mouse is, see where my mouse is? It says constraint axis, Y, right? It'll actually show you what the constraint axis is. And also, it says global Y on the left, global Y, down here where my arrow is. Global Y means it's on the global axis, not the local axis of the actual object. We'll talk about that later. But think about the global axis as the coordinate system of the entire world. It's world space, okay? If I want to keep my rotations or transformations, I need to press the left mouse button. When I press the left mouse button, my translations, my rotations are exactly what I've made them, okay? Also notice on the left-hand side, before I do anything else, I have control over what I've done. So I can actually modify my rotation to be exact right here, right now. If I do anything else, any other transformation, this control will disappear. All right, so an example is, here's my vector. It looks like my scaling on the y-axis is 1.053. Notice it's all only on the y-axis. That's the constraint that I put in. If I want to, I can actually modify this right here, right now on the y-axis. I can also modify it on the x-axis, but it has no effect because my x is not checked. If I check the x, it'll actually take that as well. I can actually expand across only 2 axes if I want, right? It's right here just before you do anything else. Also, it'll change the orientation, and we'll talk about proportional editing it later on. But you can have a lot of other things here that you have available to do. Okay, so really, really cool stuff in terms of scaling. And if I was to start a new scene, let's start a new scene. So Control N to start a new scene. Sometimes we need to do that because it just resets us. I have 3 objects by default in the scene. I have over here my camera. My camera is the thing that will be used to render my scene. And if I want to see what the camera sees, I press the 0 key on my numeric keypad. That's what the camera will see. All right, so that's what my scene will actually look like when it's fully rendered. If I was going to, do a photorealistic scene and print this out and maybe manipulate it in Photoshop later on, I can do it like this. I can actually render it by using the 0 key, right? If I press the 0 key again, it takes me back out of that. So it's a toggle, toggles in and out of the camera view, right? Because right now, when I'm looking at things, I'm looking at it in the viewport view. It's almost like I have a viewport camera that's right here that allows me to see the scene, right? But I want to see it in the perspective of how I'm going to render it, then I'm going to use the camera view. I also have a light way in the back here. If I right-click this light, this lamp on the scene, you can see that I have a point lamp. That's what it's called. Right now, we haven't talked about lighting, so right now we don't care about it. But eventually, we're going to notice that these things are here. If I want to hide anything in my scene, I want to hide it, right? On the right, you have this little panel, right? There's another panel over here. What was this panel called? Do you guys remember? In Unity, it's called the hierarchy. In Blender, it's called the outliner. That's what it's called. And these are important things to note because whenever you talk to somebody who knows Blender, you talk to them in the language of Blender, which is the outliner. That's what it's called, okay? So if you notice here, you've got the camera, the cube, and the lamp, right? If I want to hide something, there's a little eye, just like it would be in Photoshop. If I click the eye, it hides the object I don't care about. For example, the lamp is now hidden. I want to hide the camera, I click the eye here. And if I hover over the eye, you can see that I can press Control, and I want to object hide, right? And if I want to hide something, if I right-click on this object and I want to hide it, and if I press space and I want to press hide, right? Show hide, the render view is 11, right? That's interesting. I can also hide certain parts of my scene, right? And we're going to talk about that later on. And I believe it's Alt-H. Alt-H hides an object. So if I press Alt-H, right? It brings back these objects that are hidden. Right? Alt-H brings them back. Alt-H again doesn't do it. If I press H, it hides everything. Anything that's thing. So Alt-H brings everything back. Anything that's highlighted, like for example my cube, if I want to hide it, I press the H key and it's gone. H hides it, right? Alt-H. Alt-H brings it back, right? So sometimes, so why am I showing this? Because sometimes we need to hide something, a face, because we want to work on another face behind that one. and it's blocking us. We can't see what we're working on, right? So we want to hide some part of the object that we're looking at, okay? In other programs, we can also do something called ghosting, which is where we don't hide it, but we put it so it's really, the opacity is really low. I don't believe you can do that so much in Blender. You can only hide and bring it back. Okay, so this is kind of advanced controls we're talking about here. So again, this part is the outliner. This part is kind of like a toolbar. If I want to hide the toolbar, this whole toolbar here, I want to give myself more space, I can press the T key. The T key hides the toolbar and brings it back, all right? One thing you cannot hide is this stuff. This stuff here on the right, you can't hide it, but you can squash it. So I can, if I take my my cursor and put it right to the edge, you can see that I get these double arrows. That gives me the global windows thing that tells me I can hide something. I can actually push it right to the edge. Look, right to the edge. I can give myself as much space as I need, but I can't really take it away, okay? Not really. I can also squash these little panels. This is the panel. This is almost like the properties panel. That's what I like to call it. Or the inspector. It'd be like equivalent to the inspector in Unity, right? I can kind of pull this all the way up to the top. I can pull it all the way down to the bottom to give myself more room or less room if I want to. And I can also do custom panels, which we'll talk about later, right? So Blender is like flying a plane in some ways. Blender's got a lot of hidden controls and everything. It's been something that's been developed over many years, and they've added new features all the time. So you're going to see some stuff in Blender like, why is it there? And it's because Blender was a patchwork of controls. Blender 2.8 is coming out probably next year, and they're going to do some elimination. They're going to do some stuff where they pack controls in a certain space. It's going to screw some people up because they already used to how Blender looks like and works. And some of the things we can do in Blender won't be available the way it's done now. All right, so again, right-clicking selects things. We talked about that, and not left-clicking. But if you really wanted to change your control scheme, you could. The way you do that is if you go to File, and if I go to User Preferences, there is a bunch of user preferences you can put in. Okay, for example, in the interface section, notice that the display is 1. You can change that. Here's the manipulator. You can change the size of your manipulator to make it bigger, right? The handle size and everything else. You can customize this if it makes sense for you, right? This is very important to understand how you can modify stuff. I can add menus, right? Different kind of menus. It says menus open on mouse over, right? So if I click this little button, open on mouse over, and if I save my user settings, I'll come back here, right? And just leave. And then if I'm mousing over something, you know, it's supposed to give me a menu. If there's some kind of menu to do, I can get that. I'm not really getting a mouse over menu right now, so it doesn't do it. But let me just go back to user preferences. So that's open on mouse over. It says top level 5 and so on. Oh no, do I have to press space bar? I think it's space bar that I got to press on top of the, yeah. No, it's not that. Forget how to do it. I don't really use it, so I'm just telling you that there's a lot of options here that you can do. Let's undo this one. Size of manipulator, cursor depth, cursor lock adjust, a bunch of different things you can do here to modify stuff. 2D viewports, you can modify pretty much the way Blender looks and feels. Tooltips by hovering. You can have a large cursor if you want, and other things, right? So that's one thing that navigating the interface allows you to do. If I go to editing, so you can see that new objects enter edit mode. You can actually put that in there. That's something you can do that. I don't recommend that. We're going to talk about the grease pencil later on. That allows you to change the grease pencil to size. Node editor, F-curve visibility, and a bunch of other things. You can see that there's a ton of stuff that we haven't even learned about, and it's here, right? Duplicate data on lamp, material, texture, action, particle. You can do those things. Here's my input. Notice my presets. Here's presets. So if I like Blender, I can use Blender presets. If I want Maya, if you're used to Maya, I can use Maya presets. All the same keys that you can use on Maya, you can use in Blender. If you're like a 3D Studio Max person, you can use 3D Studio Max inputs. It'll be the same. So if you really want to left click and not right click, you can use Maya's presets to move around. Let's try this out. Let's try Maya instead of Blender on the input presets, right? Here's input presets. And if I press save user settings, right? And I go back out now, if I left click, I select. Notice I'm selecting with my left click. right? My right click doesn't do anything. It just moves my three-dimensional cursor, right? And if I middle mouse wheel, press in, I do that. If I press my shift, right? Actually, that's one thing it doesn't do. Oh yeah, so control and middle mouse wheel zooms in, and trying to figure out all the other stuff that you can do. But basically, the presets are different. In Maya, you can left click instead of right click. I personally like doing things the Blender way, so I'm going to go back into go back to user preferences and go to what I like. So again, user preferences, and I want to go back to Blender. So I go back to Blender presets. Okay. Mouse, emulate 3-button mouse. If you don't have a 3-button mouse, you can emulate it in Blender if you want to kind of zoom and do stuff without a 3-button mouse. Highly recommend a 3-button mouse though. Okay, guys, don't try and do Blender or any other 3D program without a 3-button mouse. Save user settings. Add-ons. There's a ton of add-ons you can do. One thing to note is I want to tell you the add-ons I recommend you clicking on now. And what we're going to do. There's some parts of Blender that is by default, there's add-ons that are not enabled. Let's enable some add-ons. So I want to scroll down. You can see that there's Add Mesh, Archimesh, the Archie pack. There's also the Animal, right, and a bunch of other ones. We don't have to do that, but the ones I want you to do, I'm going to scroll down here to see the ones that I want you guys to use. Okay, import, export, FBX format. That needs to be turned on if it's not already turned on. So if you go all the way down, scroll down add-ons, you can do this one. By the way, you can also filter on the top left corner. You can see that which ones do I want to use, right? And you can also search them out. So if I search like, FBX, you can see that FBX, export FBX should be turned on, okay? Typically it is. Let's keep going for add-ons. And the reason I'm showing you this stuff is because that way you have the same view as me, right? So that way we're not gonna, okay, import, export, images as planes. Please put that on, okay? That should be something you turn on. We're gonna keep going. Something that I think you need. Okay, mesh, loop tools. Please turn that on. Mesh loop tools. Loop tools is like a really, really useful program or a set of add-ons you can use to make your life easier. We'll talk about that. And I don't think there's anything immediately that I can tell you again that I'd like you to put on right now. Okay, so that's about it. So those are the tools I want you to put on. When you've clicked this on, if you click Save User Settings, every time you launch Blender, it'll remember, right? So you don't have to do this again. Themes. Here's something. You can change your themes the way Blender looks by going to themes. There's some presets. For example, if you like, different kinds of colors or whatever, you can try some of these out, right? The default views. There's, for example, let's say I want a really black theme. I can do that. I can go dark mode in Blender if you like that kind of thing. You can test some of this stuff out too. So in themes, back to black. Here's 24 blues. Let's do a couple of them that are really cool. Blender 24X. There's also Graph. I like this one a lot. Graph View. It's got some good. What I like to say is it's good contrast between what you see. And if you go to hexagon, it's not bad. If you like that kind of gray look. And if you really don't like any of these looks, you can always go back to default. Right? So that's a default plus. And if I reset the default theme, this is the default theme goes back to this. So you can always reset back to default theme if you mess up. Don't worry about it. So if you really like a dark theme, back to black is really, really cool. And I recommend back to black a lot of times for things like if you have a very light colored objects. And let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm not going to save the settings for a second, and we'll come back here in a second. But notice now how this object appears to be much easily seen in the scene because you're highlighting different parts. Whereas the gray is difficult to see. Here you can see everything. The challenge with back to black is that it's sometimes hard to see some of the text. But I like to use back to black in a dark room. I find that white on, grays, even grays in a dark room like this can really hurt your eyes, right? Or be hard on your eyes, especially if you're a Blender artist that's working a long time on something. So that's why I like to go dark. Programmers do it a lot too. They use dark themes when it comes to programming, as opposed to light themes. It's a favorite thing of programmers. Sometimes they also go amber. They have an amber theme as well. But we're going to keep it as a dark theme for now. And we can always go back to something later. So for me, I'm going to just produce in dark themes for now on. So here's my user preferences. I can always reset the default themes. I'm going to save my user settings here. File. This is the default locations for different things. If you want, for example, your fonts to be in a certain location, your textures to be in a certain location, scripts and sounds, and your temporary data, and all this stuff, you can preset all this stuff so that way when you try and save things out, it goes to certain places. And your system, don't touch this stuff too much. What it does is it tells you how your system operates if you're using a CPU or GPU and stuff like that. I'd leave this stuff alone for now, okay? Questions around your preferences. This is really important stuff, guys, because this makes sense of what it kind of changes the way Blender operates and how it looks. Okay, so we're in back to black theme. This is where I recommend it for programmers and artists, right? To start off, it's dark. It's not a lot of contrast here on the edges, but it's really cool that you can see some stuff in here. Notice that the objects that are not on are grayed out, which is kind of cool. And you still see the what looks like the grid. I'm just trying to see what it looks like on your screen here, right here. So really cool stuff that you can look at. Okay, so again, we've gone through preferences. Okay, N. If I want to bring up the numeric key control, I press N. The N key brings up this additional toolbar. Take a look at this. You guys should have already seen this last week, right? So what it allows me to do is it allows me to manipulate things, an object that I'm seeing right here, numerically. So if I want to change the location of an object, by the way, what are the default units in Blender? I asked you this question last week. Blender units, right? It's kind of an easy, silly question. But if you notice here, my location on the y-axis, x-axis, and z-axis are all zeros. I can also lock some of this stuff up. If I never want an object to move on one of the axes, I can lock it to prevent myself from doing it by accident, right? But for now, let's say I want to move it on the y-axis 1 unit. So I can just put in 1 unit, and it can move exactly on the y-axis 1 unit. Now, this is important when with the exercise we're going to be doing today. Sometimes we want precision, right, as opposed to doing it by your eye, okay? I can undo that action by pressing Control Z. Okay, this is important as well. We also talked about, I want to build my Blender objects by going and putting something in a specific type of unit. I don't want to use Blender units. I want to use meters. How do I do that? You guys remember? This is review. Well, so we have our numeric controls here. If I press N, it goes away. If I press T, the toolbar goes away. I have a lot more view here. On the right, you have this other toolbar that comes up, right? You have your properties. The properties are broken in a bunch of tabs. Let's go over these tabs. The first tab that looks like a camera, here's the camera, it's actually your render tab. Okay, so if I hover over this, it tells you the render. This is rendering tab, okay? The next tab over, right, again, is render layers, okay? And we're not going to really handle render layers for now. But render layers, you can actually layer your rendering by putting things together. There's a tab, one more tab over. If I go to the next tab, the third tab from the left, right? And this is the scene tab. And if you notice, the scene tab also gives you unit presets on the right-hand side. So notice the unit presets right now is nothing. And if I go here and I choose meters, that will match what my unit presets are for Unity, which is where we're going to take this stuff in. And if you notice on the top left corner, it changes the units right here. It says meters on the top left corner when you've changed that, okay? It's important, guys, to move into meters before you start your stuff. It modifies your numeric values. Notice it says 0 meters now, right? 1 meter. This is how big this is. The scale, look at the dimensions are 2 meters by 2 meters, right? It's a different thing than what we had before. Okay, cool. So that is this, the scenes. The next tab over is the world tab. The world tab has world values. Things like what your world sky is going to look like, any ambient occlusion that you want to add in to the world, and so on. We're going to talk about that later on. But a bunch of world-specific settings, right? We're going to keep going. The middle one, this little one that looks like a cube, if you look at it, it says cube, right? And it says it's really the object tab. The object tab will change depending on what you have selected. For example, if I change the camera, right, there's going to be it's just going to say camera, right? If I change to the lamp, if I click on the lamp, it's going to say lamp. And it'll give you different object properties all in one view. So it shows you your location, your rotation, and your scale. That's your transform. It shows you your rotation modes, X, Y, Z, Euler, right? The type of rotation you're doing. It shows you everything. I'm just looking at right now the lamp, right? It's a game object though. It's an object in Blender, all right? So that's what this object view does. It's a little cube that's in the middle of your screen here. Let's go back to our cube. And now let's go to the next one. There's a one that looks like a little link, like a chain. Okay, let's go to that one. That says constraints. And notice I don't have any constraints, but I can certainly add them in. Not right now though, but that's what this thing is right now. Okay, the next one, this is really important, is your modifiers. Here's your modifiers. And I can add modifiers. We're going to be doing that today. Okay, modifiers. It's important to do stuff. The one after that one, the little thing that looks like a bunch of little points here. Okay, it says the data object. This is your data. And we can add things like shape keys and UV maps and vertex colors and so on. The one after that one, which we're going to be using today, is the material tab. It looks like this. This is the fourth one from the right. Very, very important. And the material tab allows us to change the colors of the object. But I want you to think about the material tab as the shaders that we're using. Okay? Does anyone know what a shader is? Philip is nodding his head. Everyone else is not saying anything. I want you to think about a shader as a program that allows me to modify how the object looks in three-dimensional space, how it reflects light. You know, I want you to think about it as having different properties: roughness, metalness, all this kind of stuff, glossiness, transparency. All that stuff is the shader. And Blender calls it a material because the material is a bunch of these different aspects or properties of how the object will look in three-dimensional space. Okay, so color is a property of the material. So if I want to make this whole thing red, then if I go down to the diffuse property, notice here, take a look. Here's the diffuse property. And I like to also call these channels. This is almost like another channel. So again, let's bring up the material tab. I'm just going to bring this up so you guys can see it a little better. So I'm going to squash up. Sorry, I'm going to squash up the outliner for a second and take away this, so you do have more space. So notice we have a preview, and you can see the previews. There's different kinds of previews you can do. I can look at it as the preview as a plane, the preview as a sphere, the preview as a cube, the preview as a monkey, right? That's what it looks like here. The preview as something else, some lines, right? And different kinds of previews, all right? So you can look at the preview in different spaces, right? Let's go back to the preview as a cube for a second. So this is my cube, right? Or my sphere. You can see what it looks like. You see that there's a bit of a highlight. Take a look. There's a little highlight over here, almost like a hotspot, okay? But here's the diffuse channel. If I click inside the diffuse channel here, you can see that I can change the color value. So I can change the color to whatever I want, notice, by dragging and clicking. So this is the color that I want, and this is the value, okay? So for people who are artists, value means brighter or darker, okay? Brighter or darker. So I can increase my values here, and I can change my color here, no matter what I want, right? So if I want to make it hotter, you know, I can do that. Notice that it's RGB. I can change to HSV if I want to, or hex. If you want a hex code and you want to match something that you found on the net for a specific color, you can do that here. And you can see the hex code down here, right? And this changes the color property of my shader. This is only one property. It's not just the only thing. It's not the color of the cube. It's a material, a program that has been applied to my cube, okay? I want you to think of it that way. So what I mean by that is I can use the same material on different objects, okay? So right now my cube, my material, over here where it says material, it just says material, right? Let's make my cube green. So if I double click on this material, I can change the name to green, right? A green material, let's just say, right? And I can change my diffuse property or my diffuse channel to make it more green. So there's my green material. I also can lower the values, right? The brightness, if you will, down so that it's not as bright green. There we go. Okay. If we want to go crazy, let's make the cube, change the cube's name, right? The cube's name can be changed in the outliner. Remember we did this. The cube can change from cube. Let's make this the player. Call it player. All right. Here's my player object. My cube is the player. Yay. It's wonderful. Notice also I have this specular channel. So I have diffuse and specular. By the way, this all changes when we go to cycles rendering. Right now, on the top of Blender, take a look over here. We have a rendering engine that we're using, a way of drawing the objects in Blender in 3D. This rendering engine by default is called Blender Render. There's other modes that we're going to explore in this course. But right now, we're going to leave it on Blender Render. Okay, so we have our diffuse property and we have our specular property. Our specular property is the shininess, right, of our object. If I click inside there, you can see that I can also change the color of my shininess. But what we really want is the intensity here. Notice the intensity is 0.5. If I click inside this value and drag, click and drag to the left, I can change the shininess of my object. Take a look at the preview over here. If I want to make it super shiny, I can increase the value to 1. If I want to make it completely matte, so not shiny at all, I can lower that to 0. So now there's no shininess at all. No highlights, if you will. Almost highlights from light. It kind of emulates what light would look like if it was hitting my object and how shiny my object would be. If I want to make it super shiny, right, it'll appear a little glossy, if you will. Also, there's something else on the bottom called hardness, right? I can reduce it to 1, so super hard, or I can increase it so to make it a little softer. By default, the default value is 50, right? Something around 50. And if I lower it even more, I can make it so that the light is even harder when it hits my object. This gives you the preview right here, what it looks like, right? So right now my hardness is set to 9. If I can also move it back numerically, so I can say 50. So put that back to 50. So for me, I don't want my object to have any specularity. I'm going to bring that right down to 0. So now my object is matte. It's matte green. There's no specular at all. So again, my intensity here is, I want you to think about this as brightness, right? So I can bring down my intensity of my diffuse property up and down as well, same way, numerically. Also, on the right is the algorithm, the program that's being used to calculate the light that's hitting the object, okay? On the right, you have 2 different programs right now. One is Lambert. That is the name of a classic shader, a diffuse shader program that's being used. And there's another one called Cook-Tor. By the way, Cook-Tor is Cook Torrents. It comes from 2 guys that made the algorithm. All right, Cook Torrents. The one I like to use a lot is Fong. All right, this Fong shader. Fong is the one that you can use. Specular Fong is a classic shader, the Fong shader, that we can use for specular highlights. Right now it's 0, but I want you to point this out, that you can change the how the object looks from both the diffuse channel and the specular channel. Now you're going to say, Tom, why do we need this? Well, because this is what makes your object look and feel like something. Okay. So materials are very simple. Right now I've only made this green material that's very matte. Okay. Other values in the material side, all right? You can do things like, does it emit light? Is it shadeless? If I click on shadeless, it becomes completely lit. It doesn't matter if there's light on the object or not. If I click shadeless, notice it goes away. When I click it away, it takes that away. And when I click it away, it takes away things like specular highlights and even diffuse. It just makes it shadeless, almost unlit if you think about it from a programming perspective. Okay. You can add transparency. We're not going to do that right now. You can click on the transparency layer and click that on, and you can do a bunch of other things here that we're not going to handle today. We're going to come back to the material. I just wanted to show you the minimum. You can always say wire. Here's what the wire would look like: volume or halo. if you look at halo, you can see that now my object has gone into 4 little points. I'm just clicking this little button right here, halo. Volume, wire, or surface. Okay, those are the options that you have here. Let's leave it at surface. We'll come back to this. So kind of interesting stuff. So we have a lot of control over how an object looks, right? But right now, the entire object is green. How about if I wanted to make only one of the faces green? Well, right now, we've only defined in our materials, we only have one material called green. By the way, I can remove this material by clicking the minus sign. If I click the minus sign, take a look, it goes away. And now there's no material applied. That means this is the default material that you see here, okay? No material, guys, is bad. No material means I can't put any kind of image or make it look a certain way, okay? It has no information for how it's going to appear in the scene. It just has a default look. And there's no diffuse, there's no specular highlights, it's nothing, it's blank, okay? We never want to export something with this kind of default material unless in the program we're going to be using, like so for example, Unity, we have another material we have in mind that we're going to use, okay? But material tells us, gives the computer the information, the program that you're using, the information of how the object will appear in the scene. The light, the lights, all that stuff, okay? For now, if I want to select a material we've already defined, we define one material called green, right? Think about it as a property, a set of properties, okay? I can define as many materials as I want and apply any of the materials that I want to any of the faces or vertices I want. So right now, if you look here on the left, there's a little material option. If I click here, I can select green. I can select green because I made it, and now it's back. Even though if I subtract means I take away this slot, right? And I've taken it away. If I put it back, I can put it back, right? Or I can add another material. Let's make a material that's another color, like blue. So I'm going to click on this little plus. And notice there's a blank material, right? I'm going to click. I've created another slot. That's what I've done here, another slot. And in the bottom here, you can see that I have this little new button. If I click the new button, it gives me a brand new material by default, right? The material is defaulted material. It's got a diffuse value and a specular value, right? Again, these two channels right now are Lambert and Cook-Tor. Let's make the material something like blue. So we'll just change the name, make it blue. I'm just writing blue in here. And I'm going to change the diffuse value from what looks like green right now, or whatever it is. I want to make it into blue. All right, so I'm just changing the diffuse value, pulling it into the blue spectrum here. And I want to change the value so it's kind of a darker blue, okay? Here's what I want to do differently. I really want to turn up the intensity of this blue to make it really blue and shiny. So I want to take the specular value and increase it to 1. So it's a really shiny area that's blue. Okay? Cool. So I have two materials, green and blue. Notice the blue has a little shiny little point here. Even the little preview has a shiny point. Okay. If I click on blue, and I want to make blue the default material for this thing, for this object, I can use the little arrow keys down here. Check out the little arrow keys to bring it up. And when I do that, this object is the one on the top. This green object is the one on the bottom, right? But notice that my object still shows this green color, okay? So my object shows this green color, right? Why? Because I have two colors here, and the last one I applied to this object was the green object. If I don't want the green to appear, I can just remove it. And now my object becomes blue, or appears to be blue. Okay? Again, it's not really blue. What I'm taking is, I'm saying all sides should have this response to light. I want, when light hits this object, that it appears to be blue and shiny. That's what I want, right? Okay, if I go into edit mode now, how do I go into edit mode? Tab. If I go tab, press in edit mode, you can see that my whole object is blue. If I press A to deselect all, and I zone in, right? I want this face to be green. How do I do that? Well, first of all, I get to shift into face select mode. How do I do that? How do I shift into face select mode? You can do space or control tab. If I press control tab, I can select face. Control tab. And then you're going to see these little dots in the middle of my faces. If I right click and select this face here, right click, okay, I can add back my green shader, right? I can add a space. Here it is. And I can select my green shader. Here's my green shader. And now what I have the option to do is I want to assign this green shader to this face. Notice there's an assign button inside of edit mode. If I click assign here, now this face is green by clicking the assign button. I've clicked on the shader, so blue. If I want to make this back to blue, I can just click assign and it goes back to blue. So each face, I can click each face and assign a different color. Go to green, assign a different color. It looks like now that this is green, right, on this face, and blue on these faces, right? I can choose another face. Let's make the opposite face green as well. All right, so I want to click that, click on the green material, and click assign. And what this does, it gives me two faces that have green, and the rest of them are blue. Okay, so why is this important? It's important because you can make your object look the way you like by adding things like your colors, right? Now, the material doesn't just have colors. It also can carry something called a texture. We talked about this before, right? A texture is an image. And I can add an image to this part of the object with using another tab. But we're not going to do that right now, okay? So now we have these two colors, right? They have green and we have blue. Just to make it back, so I know we have, Paul just came in. I want to make sure that you guys can see this in regular mode. So I'm going to go back to my user preferences, and I'm going to go back to themes, and I'm going to click on my default theme. All right, here's my default theme so you can see it. So this is what it looks like. You have blue here and you have green here. Okay, I'm going to leave this for now because otherwise, if you're a default user, you won't see stuff the way you should see it, and you might get confused. All right, so okay, cool. So who cares? You're going to say, right? Let's add another. Let's go back into object mode by pressing tab, and let's add another object, a plane. I want the plane to sit underneath the blue and green cube. Okay, so I want to press Shift A to add a new mesh. I want to add a plane. Here it is. And the plane by default, hey, look it. How come it appeared over here? I wanted it to appear over here. How come it went over here? Does anyone know?
Because of the point that goes.
The cursor, the three-dimensional cursor is wherever the object appears. Let's undo that. Control Z to undo. I want to move my cursor back to the center. Does anyone know that? How to do that?
Just drag or just.
No, it's easier than that. Shift S. If you press Shift S, this is the key, the key binding for this. You say cursor to center. Shift S. This is important. And then bam, it goes back into the middle. Now let's do that again. Shift A to add a new mesh. I want to say plane. The plane appears to be in here. I want to scale it, my plane, so it takes up the whole grid. There's my plane. It takes up the whole grid. You should see this. Look, oh, my poor cube is inside the middle of the plane, right? I want to bring it up. I want to bring it up exactly 1 meter. Remember we changed the meters? How do I do that? Numerically. I can go here, numerically. That's one way of doing it. There's many ways to do the same thing. I can press the G key and move it up by 1 meter across the Z axis. Let's do it that way. I'll do it a bunch of ways, okay? So if I want to do it here, just in the scene, I can press the G key and then the Z key. So I want to move. G is go. I look at it as go. Go to, where am I going to? The G key across the Z axis, and I want to move 1 up. That's one way of doing it. Press Enter to accept, all right? That's one way. Let's undo that. The other way to do it is to pull it up. I want to pull it up, and you know, on the top left, on the bottom left, you're going to see some controls here that come up. I just pressed T to bring it back, to toggle the toolbar back up. And notice on the left, it says 1.02. It's close. I can actually press in there and press 1. That'll do it exactly what I want. That's another way of doing it, okay? And the other way, let's undo that change. It's down here. The other way to do it is if I press the numeric keypad and go to the Z location here and press 1. Right? So it's all the same You can choose whichever way you want to do that, but now it's sitting exactly on top of the plane. Okay? N to toggle the properties on and off. T to toggle the toolbar on and off, right? Okay, so cool. I've got this cube sitting on a plane. Let's give the plane a material. So if I right-click on the plane, notice that there's no material set. No materials here. I want to create, I can also, by the way, choose the same material. What if I want to make the plane the same as color as the cube? I don't have to even set a material. I can just go here to my little material and just choose blue. And then boom, the plane is blue too. The exact blue, by the way. The exact blue that I chose, not a random blue. I'm using the exact same material. I'm using the same program to tell the plane how it should receive and cast light. Okay, that is what I'm doing. Think about it as a skin that I'm putting all over the cube, right? Or the plane. And that skin has a certain set of properties. By the way, guys, this is the technical part of the artist, okay, that I'm talking about. All right, so I don't want my blue. I want to remove that. And I want to create another plane, another color here. Let's make it a brown color. So I'm going to make a new material. It gives me my default material settings. I want to click the diffuse area, and I'm going to choose something that looks brownish. Right? Again, something like it's in here. You notice the preview is telling you what it looks like. It doesn't really show brown here. It's more like an orange color. And I can make it more brown by changing the intensity. Right? So I want to change the intensity so it's more brownish. Here's my brown. And I'm going to change the material name to brown by double-clicking. I'm saying brown. Not really a brown material, all right? It's actually just a value that I'm giving it. Okay, cool. So I've got brown here, right? And I have access to 3 materials now. Look, I've got a blue, brown, and green material that I can access. Cool. So I've got these 3 things. And now for the first time ever, we're going to see some light work. How does light work in the scene? Okay, so cool. So notice on the bottom, right now we're in object mode. If I go to edit mode by tapping in the tab button, I'm in here. And it looks exactly the same, right? However, this is just the default view. That's shadeless. I want to add light. How do I do that? On the object, where the object mode is, if you go here to object mode, this doesn't help us. This is just telling me what to do. This is how I manipulate my object. But this second one right here, it looks like the little ball that's right here. See this one? This one here is how I see it. It says viewport shading on it, right? If I want to see the texture, I can click on texture. Right now there's no texture, right? If I want to see the material, I can see the material mode. And now, if you notice material, I get this shiny color. And it looks like it's somewhat partly lit. If I go one more up, I can go to, from material to rendered. And this is what the scene will look like when it's fully rendered. Take a look, guys. All right? It's going to try and render the scene in real time. Now look at what it does. If I do this, if I press rendered, if I move the scene, it tries to render it and give me a preview of what it looks like when I do photorealistic rendering. If I was going to put this on a picture somewhere, a picture frame, think of it that way, right? I want to make this a real looking picture. This is what it would look like as a preview. This is a low level or low lo-fi way of looking at something that I want to photorealistically render. What it would look like. Where's the light going to appear? Where are the shadows going to be? How is it going to look? It's not the actual photorealistic rendering yet. It's just a preview. Now notice what I have here. I have light that's here, and I have this shiny floor. Why? Because the default brown color that I gave, the brown material, has a specularity of 0.5. That means it's half shiny. If I want to turn that completely down, the intensity, I can turn it right down to 0, and now there's no shine on the floor. It does not reflect light. That's what I'm telling it to do, right? Okay, and notice the intensity of the brown. So I've got no reflectiveness on this material anymore, right? Or no shininess. Okay, cool. So now you can see that where the light is, here's the light where it's cast. Okay, and this is my preview. Let's go back to solid mode. That's the default mode we do our, when we kind of do any kind of modeling, we do it usually in solid mode. Okay, starting off at least. Okay, there's also something called wireframe. You can go into wireframe mode by pressing the Z key. Z key actually sees everything in a wire. All right, take a look at that. So if I right click on this cube, it sees only the wires, right? The wires, almost like the wireframe of just what the object is. Any of the edges and vertices and faces that are going to appear. Notice this object has, how many quads does this cube have? 6. 6 quads. How many vertices does this cube have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? How many edges does this cube have? 12, right? And if you look at this object has, again, the total number of objects in the entire scene is verts 12, faces 7, tries 14, right? This is the numeric representation of how many objects and how many faces the entire scene has. Also, the total memory this thing takes, 48 megs, the scene that I'm rendering right now, okay, in the player. This is important. When we talk about low poly objects, right now my cube is a very low poly object. It only has 6 polygons, right, that make it up. 1, 2, 3 each face. And they're all quads, okay? They're all quadrangles, right? They're not triangles. Triangles, when we render something, especially when it comes to painting something later on, is a no-no, guys. Avoid triangles at all costs, as much as you can, right? You have a triangle, you've done something wrong, right? Last week, didn't matter. Last week, you were playing around, navigating. This week, and from now on, we want to avoid triangles. It's different if I'm just making a photorealistic scene. That's not what we're doing here. We're making assets for games. Assets for games being rendered by a game engine needs to be quadrified, if you will. We're also going to triangulate later, all right? But in the beginning, you're going to use quads. Because when you do your texture painting, right, if the quads aren't about the same size, you're going to have deformations in your painting. Imagine if you have a painting and everything is in a grid, right? But example, now you squash that grid down. You in one area of the painting, you do one of these. You squash it down this way or squash it down this way. It's going to be skewed. So you're going to have skewing, right? The smaller the quads, the more skewed your texture is going to look. I'll show you this later when we do UV mapping, okay? So you want the things, the UVs, right, or the squares that represent each of the faces of your object to be approximately the same size, all right, as much as you can. All right, let's go back to solid mode. So solid mode, press Z, the Z key, go back and forth from solid to wireframe. Okay, this is important to show you. And again, notice that I have this thing. Here's the light. Look, here's my point lamp. My point lamp is over here, right? If I want to move my point lamp around, but I want to get a preview of what it's going to look like, I go back to material. And if I drag my point lamp down, you can see that as I drag my point lamp down, one part of the scene becomes brighter and the other one becomes darker, right? I don't yet have shadows. I have a point lamp. Okay, that's what it looks like. A point lamp is one of the different lamps that we can use. I'm going to add another lamp. Let's go Control, so Shift A. I'm going to go down to lamp. Here's my lamp, and I'm going to add a spot lamp, or a spotlight, as they're called, right? So notice my spotlight appears at the origin where my three-dimensional cursor is, and I'm going to bring the spotlight up. Take a look what I get here. So here's spotlight, and I'm going to drag it across this way. Okay, so I can drag my spotlight. I'm in material mode, by the way. That's why I'm seeing this. If you're not seeing this scene, you're probably not in the material mode. You have to change your shader, your viewport shader to material. This part, material. Okay, and here's my lamp. It's just a spot lamp. Okay, notice right now it comes straight down, right? So I'm looking at this object straight down. If I want it to be on an angle, I can rotate my lamps just like I do my objects. I can press the R key. I can rotate it across the x-axis if I want, or I can rotate across the y-axis, right? Or the z-axis. The z-axis won't do anything though. So let's rotate it across the y-axis so it kind of points at my cube.
How did you create the spotlight?
Shift A, and if I go to lamp, you can see that I can create other lights as well. Sun lamp, a hemi, an area lamp, and so on.
For the spotlight, which one did you do?
Spot. Okay, so I can make a spotlight. I have two lights in the scene now. I have a spotlight, and I have this other light right here, which is a point lamp. Think about a point lamp as a default lamp that I'm using that can give kind of ambient light to the entire scene. Remember, I can light a scene, and I can add as many lights or as little lights as I want. Okay. Remember, what's one of the principles of animation that this applies to? Do you guys remember the principles of animation? The 12 principles of animation. One of them is the one that I'm using right now, right? It's called staging, right? If I want to stage an object to give it presence, right, and appeal, I want to be able to light it in the appropriate way. This is one of the things we can do. One of the things when we think about the 12 principles of animation. So now you can see that this area was going to appear much, much brighter now because of my spotlight that I put on here. If I want to shift back into rendering, let's see what the rendered view is going to look like. Okay, let's zoom in here so I can see what my rendered view is going to look like. This is not the view of the camera. This is just the rendered view. Take a look. I have a couple of shadows now, right? One shadow from the spotlight and one shadow from the point lamp, and they're kind of being rendered together. Also notice that I have a shiny surface here where my blue material is, and a matte surface everywhere else, including the green material, because my green material is not set to have any shininess at all. I've made it matte. No shininess, right? You can change that anytime you want by modifying the material. If I go back to my object, let's say I'll go back to my cube, and I can see that the green material here is, right now it's matte. Take a look, it's matte. It has no specularity. I can increase that specularity and make it shinier, right? And now when I move my object so it can be seen by the light, if there's any kind of light on the object, it'll appear to be shinier than the other parts. Let's make it matte again. Okay, so again, this is just a preview of what I'm looking at in the scene. Okay, but what if I want to see what the rendered view is going to look like? Again, I want to see through the eyes of the camera. And the way to do that is press the 0 key on the numeric keypad. This is what the camera is actually seeing, right? This is what the actual rendered view is going to look like. And right now, the rendered view only sees this much. If I want to zoom in, I can take that whole thing so that my whole scene is looking like this. But what if I don't like what the camera sees? What if I want to move the camera around? Well, if I press N on the numeric keypad, I can scroll down to where it shows lock camera to view. On the numeric keypad, I've got my camera visible by pressing the 0 key on my numeric keypad. Brought the camera up. I've toggled it on. I can toggle it away to toggle it on, toggle it off. This is what the camera sees in the scene. And I can put on click lock camera to view. Now, when I do this and I move my view, my camera moves with me. So now my camera is actually going to see this part of my view. Notice my lock camera to view. If I uncheck that and I go back, I can make it so it fills my screen. This is what my camera will actually see. If I press 0 again, this is my scene. Bam, this is what my camera sees. Bam, this is what I actually can work with. This is what the camera sees. Cool. Now that I know what the camera can see, if I go back to rendering, which is up here, here's rendering, the little camera looking thing here, right? And if I click the render button, this render button right here, it's actually going to try and render the scene as best as it can. So render, now it's going to render the scene. And that's what the camera will look like. So if I want to render a three-dimensional scene, I can do that here in the viewport by clicking the render button. If I press escape, it's going to take me back to the default view. Right? So render like this and escape. Render and escape. Okay? Now down here, things to note is I have inside my little camera view, I have shading. Here's my shading. I have performance. I have post-processing. This is important. I can add other post-processing effects later on. And if I go further down, I have bake, freestyle, texture atlas, and a bunch of other stuff that I can turn on in this view. One of the most important parts when I look at the camera view for render, right, is the render presets. Look at this. I have a resolution of 1920 by 1080. That is the resolution of my scene, right here. Okay. I have my start frame and my end frame when I want to do animations. I want to have my animation frame rate, which right now is set to 24 frames per second. Remember I talked about Next Gen? Next Gen is a movie that's made purely by Blender. I mentioned that last time. Remember Next Gen? Next Gen movie, right? And Next Gen movie, this stuff here, right, is made purely in Blender, this whole thing, Next Gen. This whole scene, the way the characters are and everything is rendered right in Blender. And think about, I want to do this animation. I can set my frame rate. Typical movie frame rate, or in the old days, was 24 frames per second, right? However, you can change this value to whatever you want, 30, 60, custom, whatever. The higher the frame rate, the more computationally expensive it's going to be when you do your animations, all right? Aspect ratio is 1:1. I can also change other things in the camera itself. If I click on the camera itself, not the camera in the world, not the rendering, but the camera object. If I click on the camera object and go to the little camera here on the scene, this little camera part, it actually does things like focal length in millimeters, so I can replicate a 35 millimeter camera. What would a 35 millimeter camera look like if you're a camera person? Or what if I want to change the focal length to be different? If I want to move to an orthographic camera, I can do that. I can make my view orthographic or panoramic or whatever I want, okay? There's also different camera presets. You can go to a different kind of camera, like for example, a Nikon DX, or if you want to a Canon C300 or a Canon 1100D. If you want to replicate what a camera would look like, an actual camera in real life, a GoPro, or whatever. There's a lot of really cool presets that it comes with. We leave this blank typically. For when it comes to things for game development, we don't really fool around with the camera stuff in here, because a lot of times we take our objects that we create in Blender and bring them into Unity or Unreal or some other game engine or our own custom game engine, and we create our own camera in those programs. However, if you really want to look and feel, you want to make a photorealistic scene for a movie, you want to do a little cutscene or whatever, you can fool around with the camera for sure. Okay, if I want to go back to this, the rendering aspect, my render presets also have different things. I can go to HDTV, 1080p. If I want to do 720p or something else, I can change the render presets inside of my camera view to whatever I want, okay? So this is what the scene will look like. Wow. Okay, lots of stuff, and I can keep going. Like, there's a lot of ways of making your scene look the way it is. One thing we need to do, though, is, and what I want you to do inside your view on the right here, in your properties panel, is notice where it says shading here. It says multi-texture as a shading. I want you to move away from multi-texture. Take a look, guys. You need to do this. Multi-texture. I want you to move from multi-texture to GLSL. GLSL is OpenGL's default shading language. Okay, that's what it does. And what it does is when I go back into material mode, it gives me a different look and feel than multi-texture, right? Can't really tell, but GLSL is a different look and feel. It responds to shaders a little differently, especially in rendered mode. If I go back into my rendered, here's my rendered mode, what it looks like. And if I go from GLSL to multi-texture, there is a difference in the way it renders the scene. You can't really tell right now, but there is. Okay, something else to note. Okay, if I go back out of rendered and into solid, right? Solid view, sometimes we want to see what an object will look like with different kinds of materials, right? And what I can do is if I right click on a material, right? And if I go where it says matte cap, take a look at matte cap on the right here. If I click matte cap, I can choose a set of materials that I want my object to look like. Now, again, this is just for testing. So if I click on the material, I have a set of preset materials that I can use. Take a look at this. Let's say I want my object to be really shiny and metallic looking, like this, like a little gold object. I can do that. My whole scene is set to be shiny and metallic looking, right? And if I go back to rendered, you can see now that it looks normal, right? If I go to material, I can see that it looks normal. If I go to texture, it looks normal. But if I go back to solid, it has this shiny aspect to it, almost like I'm looking at a shiny gold material, right? I can also look at it in other ways, like I want to make it red, or I want to make it this green color. Sometimes it's important to try these things out, to give a look and feel of what it would look like, in a different aspect. So matte cap is kind of interesting. Let's uncheck that. All right, the other one is textured solid, right? And then there is something called ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is very interesting. I'm going to put that back into material mode for a second. What ambient occlusion does, it creates wherever there's a crease or an area that should be shadow. What it can do is it can create fake shadows for you. to give you know, an object the appearance of depth. So if I notice the strength is 1 and the distance is 0.2, I can make that strength way up. So I can change the strength. So look at the shadow that's underneath the thing. This is like almost like fake shadows. I want almost like an additional shadow on top of everything else. It makes it kind of, you know, stronger looking. I can check and uncheck that property, by the way, ambient occlusion for an object. There's also something that we can talk about later on as a technique, a post-processing technique later on called screen space ambient occlusion, which means everything in the scene is going to have these fake shadows applied. Any of the valleys or the, you know, the creases in a scene can be more shadowed, right, to give that a feel of more depth. All right, it's a technique. Okay, cool. So lots of ways to make the scene appear the way you like. Okay, that's what this is. That's what I've been showing you here. Okay, challenge. Before we're going to take a short break, and I'm going to give you a challenge. I want you to go back to that spaceship that you had before from last week, and I want you to add color by using shaders and applying different shaders to the spaceship. I'm going to create a new discussion board called Colored Spaceship, right? For example, for the USS Enterprise that Philip made, I want you to add different colors, different things. You can add colors to different areas of the ship, right? One thing to note is, before we stop recording this one, is I want you to think about what we've got here. Right now, we've got a cube, right? Let's get rid of our cube completely. I'm going to delete it and add in a sphere instead. So I'm going to add in a sphere. Here's my sphere. I'm going to add a UV sphere. Now, my UV sphere is half inside the scene. Let's bring it up to the top here. So I'm going to bring it up by, I'm going to translate it. I'm going to press the G key and translate it across the Z-axis by 1 meter. So now it sits on top of the scene. There it is. It's exactly on top of the scene. It has a spherical look. But guess what? Look at these rings when I made my sphere. Does this look like a really smooth sphere? No, it has all these little quads all over the place. This is a UV sphere. A UV sphere is interesting in that each of the faces along the sphere are quads, right? If I go into edit mode, you can see that I've got a bunch of quads, right, that are all around the sphere, right? That's all they are. There's no triangles in the sphere whatsoever. Even the top, if you look at the top part of the sphere, right, you have, these are the only triangles you see on the top of the sphere. Take a look. The triangles on top of the sphere. And usually this is called a triangular fan, right? That's what this thing is. Because if you notice the top of the sphere, sorry, there's a lot of light that I'm casting here right now. But notice on the top of the sphere, let's go back to solid mode. You can see that the top of the sphere has a bunch of these triangles. So this area here on top of the sphere is the place where we're going to have the most deformation. If I was going to draw this out, think about this. I've got all these quads, and they're, instead of being quad, they're shrunk in and turned into triangles at the top of my sphere. If I was going to paint this out, you'd have deformation or skewing at the top of my sphere. But that's okay, because we're probably not going to look at the top of the sphere. Chances are, right? But the sphere looks like it's really square-ish. If I go back, you can see that this is it. And it doesn't have the material. Again, if I want to apply a material, I go to this tab right here. Let's make this the blue one so it's shiny. So I'm going to click on the material that I already have. I have 3 materials I've defined. I'm going to click blue. And now it's a shiny sphere. And you can see even more that there are certain faces that reflect the light this way. I want to make it smooth. I want to relax the way the sphere looks. And this is what you did, Philip, I think. I think you made it more relaxed. And the way to do that, if I press the tab key, or sorry, the T key to bring this part up, on the left, there's shading. There's smooth shading and flat shading. If I click smooth shading on the left, it becomes smoother. All right? Notice that it still has some deformations, but we're using a relaxed shading way of doing things. It's just another algorithm to make it look like it's actually smooth, but it's not. If I press tab and go into edit mode, it's still a bunch of vertices. Nothing's changed. Just the way it's shaded, or just the way it is rendered in object mode. It's not changed. The geometry hasn't modified whatsoever. It's all quad still, but it looks smoother. Okay, well, what if I want to make an area of my sphere sharper, like the Enterprise? How do I do that? I can add in something called creases. So if I press space to find creases, I want to do a crease, right? So I want to do a crease or an edge, if I will, right? So the couple of things you can do here, I'm in object mode right now, so it's going to be context sensitive stuff. So if I want to go to space and if I press an crease, right, I can do something called an edge crease. You can also use Control E for that. I need to select the edges that I want the crease to appear in. Let's do that, okay? So let's suppose I'm going to deselect all, and I just want this part of my sphere to be creased, this part, right? And by the way, if I go from, I'm in solid mode right now, right? You can see that I have this. I can also go into wireframe mode, right? Wireframe is good because I can see the entire sphere. I can affect faces on the back end, like this one over here, right? So that's the back face. But if I don't want that, I only want to affect the faces on the front or the edges around the front. I can press Control-Tab to go into edge select mode, right-click on the edge that I want, and if I want to click the entire edge loop, that's what this is called, the edge loop, right? I can do that by pressing Shift, Alt, and then right-click. And it selects the entire loop that we're talking about here, right? Okay, I want to add an edge crease right here, the top of my loop. I want to make this sharper, right? And to do this, there's a couple things I need to do. One is, here's my edge loop. And I want to press, again, space bar. I want to do that crease. Remember the crease? And it says edge crease, which is Shift-E. Let's do that. Shift and E. And I add an edge crease. Notice that the color changes for my edge crease, right? And I want to press Enter to select that edge. So now if I right-click away, you can't really see anything that's happened here. The edge crease is there. But if I go back out to object mode, right? And it's hard to see here. Let's see if I can do a little bit more. So go back into edit mode, and we'll do this one again. So Control, Alt, Shift, Alt, right-click. Here's my thing. I want to add an edge crease, right? So again, it's space. So crease, you can do that, edge crease. I notice it gives you a bit of control. Take a look at that. It's almost like it's saying, I want the whole edge to be selected or only some of the edges to be selected, right? Here's my edge crease. Here's the factor, right? Here's the factor. And then it says 0.085 edge crease for all this area here, right? Again, what I want to do is if I want to click away and click back, notice now that there's a little edge. It looks like the edge is darker than everywhere else. See that? The little edge is like almost like a black edge, even when I click away in other edges. Now, if I go back to edit to object mode, you can see that there is very little difference. But because we don't have any deformation, let's deform that edge. Oops. Let's deform back that edge. So go back into here. And now what I want to do is Alt, Enter. And I want to move this edge in a little bit. I want to take this area on the top only, and I want to make it smaller, just on the top part of my sphere, right? Again, there's different selection modes. I can use each edge. So I can kind of select each edge by itself. Oh, I want this edge, and I want this edge. That's going to take a long time. I can use, let's undo those. And I can undo my selections, by the way, by pressing Control Z. So undo. That's really important. No. But the undo is really interesting, right? So I can undo my selections. I can also use C-select mode, right? Circle select. It's a new thing, all right? If I press circle, here's my circles. I can actually left-click and drag everything I want to select, right? I can also make my circle bigger by, when I'm in circle select mode, I can change the size of my radius of my circle, right? To select anything I want. That's too big. And if I undo, if I selected too much, right? So if I press escape, that gets me out of circle select mode. You can see I've got some edges here that I don't like. I can undo all that stuff if I want. I can't redo. That's one way of doing it. So circle select mode. The other thing I can do is I can put this sphere in perspective, take it out of perspective and put it into one side. I can look at it in orthographic view. So I want to look at it from the front. I want to look at it exactly from the front. So no perspective whatsoever. This is the top of my sphere, right? So let's go to the front view. There it is. And if I take this into wireframe mode, right, I can see that only one edge loop is selected, but I want to select the whole top face. So again, if I want to go back down, and let's just bring this down so you can see it better. Let's get rid of this thing here, T, and let's get rid of this thing, N. And let's just bring this up so you can see it better, so you can see it. I want to make it exactly in the front view. This is front ortho view, 10 centimeters. That's how close I am. If I go in more, I can see even more, right? And again, I want to get right in there, right? Right in there. So it takes up my entire view. I want this part here to be all selected. I can use B select mode. So C select is circle select. B select is box select, okay? Box select looks like these little crosshairs. I can select this whole area right here, right? And now notice, because I have moved everything into this, the entire part of my sphere that I want has been selected. Let's go back into solid mode. You can see that that's part selected. And if I press the S key in edit mode, I can scale right here in edit mode. I can scale this thing so it's smaller than everything else, right? I can do that. Or I can click extrude, E, the E key, and I can move this out to where it is right here. Now notice the crease. Remember that crease that that's in here? I got this crease around the outside here, right? And I've got this dome. So how does this look in object mode now? It looks a little sharper. Look, it looks a little sharper. It doesn't look as, it's hard to see with the shader. Let's take the shader away. Let's take the shader away so you can see this. And let's add a default shader in there. There's my default shader. Take a look at that. All right. Now, it looks a little sharper, but not sharp around this edge here. Let's add a material that's a little bit, let's change this material to gray. Here's a gray material I'm making. I'm using this color, and I want to make it kind of a darker gray color. So I'm going to kind of go in here and change the intensity, the value of the gray color to a little darker. So kind of a dark gray, so you can see this a little better, right? So that's the new material I've defined. Okay, I don't want it to be shiny at all. So let's get the specularity away. All right. And again, we're in solid mode. That's all I care about right now. Okay. So yeah, so you can see it's kind of sharper on the top, but what about this line? This line isn't sharp at all. So if I go back into edit mode, I want this line here to be sharp as well. So again, I can press A to deselect all, and notice that there's two lines that are creased. Look at the creases. This is a darker line. See this darker line? This darker line? Those are creases. However, I want more resolution here. More resolution. How can I do that? I have to add more creases. That's what happens. So the more creases I add, the more resolution, the more sharper that area appears when I have this this mode, right? I want to add an edge loop around here. I want to add an edge loop. Right now, it's divided the way it is. I can add an edge loop by pressing Control R. Or, if you forget, I can just say edge loop, right? I can, well, I want to, here, let's do it this way. We'll say add or mesh. If you look at, if you see edges, right? And if you see that I can do an edge crease in here, right? And I want to slide edge loops. Here's an edge loop, right? Control R, what it does is it actually gives me this phantom loop that I can use, right? Let's do that again. What I can do is I can slide a loop this way, so I can make it another extra. I can give extra information. Now the quads here are very small. Remember I talked about be careful because those quads there are very, very small. The smaller the quads, the more deformation when it comes to painting. Later on, you'll see. But one thing it does do is it gives more resolution in certain areas. Like for example, here again, let's do that again. If I had another quad here, right? Another sets of loops here. I have a lot more detail in this part of my object than anywhere else. Let's do some more over here. Right, so more over there. So what this does, you can add all these loops and make them as creased as you like. So let's say, for example, I want this edge loop here to be creased. Again, it's Alt, Shift, right-click, and it selects the entire loop. Then I can crease it. So Shift E, right? I can crease the entire loop. Right, and I just pull it so it's completely selected. And if I click away, you can see now that it's black. Right, see how that's black? And it's also a different color. Take a look at that. It's also like this reddish color, right? I do the same thing here. So let's go back to this crease and Alt, Shift, right click. And if I press Shift E, And I make the, see how it turns from this color to this color? When I drag it up, I want this color, all right? And if I go back into edit mode now, you can see how it's much sharper than it was before. Take a look. Right? There's more definition here on the top. And I can keep doing that. I can add additional edges that are this color, right? So I can kind of do one of these and Alt-Shift or Alt-Shift right-click and then Shift-E, drag it so it changes that color to change that color to this, right? Which adds 100% creasing in that area, right? And when I press back the tab, it becomes that much sharper. So you can see a sharp edge now in object mode, okay? That's what I'm talking about. All right, so if you want to make something appear sharper when it's kind of made to look, let me just bring it back into perspective mode so you can see it. This is perspective. You can see that this area here looks a little bit sharper than every other part of the sphere, right? Here's the tab key. Remember, all I did here was change from flat to smooth. That's all I've done. So it looks the way it wants to look. Okay, so again, let's pause. I want to show you that stuff because I want you to go into detail. Go back into the ship that you made, right? Sharpen it where it needs to be sharp if you need to. Make it rounder where it needs to be rounded, right? Add color to your ship. And I'm going to make another discussion area where you can submit that change, okay? Let's take 20 minutes or so to do that while you work on your ship. And what I want to say when I say color is create your own materials that make sense for your ship, right? And add them in and make those materials work. Let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue with Blender.